For years, the name Nancy Guthrie carried weight. It carried grace. It carried the kind of quiet, unshakable strength that most people only read about in books. She stood in front of thousands of people and spoke about loss so devastating that most of us cannot even imagine it. She spoke about burying a child, then burying another. She held her grief in her bare hands and turned it into something that changed lives forever. But behind every public story, there is a private one dot, and behind Nancy Guthrie's carefully constructed world of faith, healing, and purpose, there were secrets, there were shadows, there were moments of doubt so deep and so dark that even those closest to her never fully understood the weight she was carrying. What investigators and those closest to her eventually uncovered was something nobody expected. It was not a scandal in the traditional sense. It was not a crime. It was something far more complex and far more human than that. It was the truth about what grief really costs a person. The truth about what happens when your public purpose and your private pain are pulling in completely opposite directions. The truth about a woman who gave everything, absolutely everything, to help others heal, while quietly wondering if she herself would ever fully survive. Stay with us, because what is about to be revealed will leave you completely stunned. If you have ever walked through a season of unbearable loss, the kind that hollows you out from the inside and leaves you wondering how the rest of the world is still moving, then you have probably heard the name Nancy Guthrie. And if you have not, then what you are about to discover will shake something very deep inside you. Nancy Guthrie is not a Hollywood celebrity. She is not a pop star or a reality television personality. She is something rarer and in many ways far more powerful than any of those things. She is a woman who took the most unimaginable pain a human being can experience, the death of not one but two of her own children, and transformed it into a ministry, a mission, and a movement that has touched millions of people across the entire world. She is a best-selling author, a sought-after speaker, a Bible teacher who has sat with grieving mothers and fathers in hospital waiting rooms, in church pews, and in living rooms across the globe. She has written books that have been read by people in the deepest valleys of their lives, books that have pulled people back from the very edge, books that have given language to a kind of pain that otherwise has no words at all. To the outside world, Nancy Guthrie is a symbol of faith over fear, of purpose rising from ashes, of a woman who stared directly into the face of tragedy, not once, but twice, and absolutely refused to be destroyed by it. But that is the version of Nancy Guthrie the world was allowed to see. The real story, the full story, is more complicated, more human, more heartbreaking, and in many ways, far more inspiring than the polished version ever could be. Because Nancy Guthrie is not superhuman. She is not made of steel. She is a woman who bled quietly for years, even while publicly helping others stop their bleeding. She is a woman who wrestled in the dark with questions she could not answer, with pain she could not always contain, and with a life that never quite looked the way she had imagined it would. This is her real story, and the world needs to hear it. Nancy Guthrie grew up in a world that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. A middle-class American upbringing, a family with faith woven into the fabric of daily life, church on Sundays, dinner at the table, the kind of childhood that looks simple in old photographs and deeply complicated up close. From a very young age, Nancy was the kind of person who leaned into questions rather than away from them. She was thoughtful, introspective. She had a mind that wanted to understand things deeply, not simply accept them at surface level. That quality would one day make her extraordinary. But as a child and a young woman, it made life feel heavier than it perhaps should have. She carried the weight of wanting things to make sense. She carried the quiet ache of searching for meaning in a world that does not always offer it easily or willingly. Like many people raised in faith, Nancy brought her questions and her fears to God, and for a long time, that felt like enough. She built a life. She found love. She married a man named David Guthrie, and together they stepped into the ordinary, beautiful rhythm of building a family, building a home, and building a future that felt full of genuine promise. But what happened next changed everything. In 1998, Nancy and David's daughter Hope was born, and from the very beginning, Hope was not like other babies. She had a rare metabolic disorder called Zellweger syndrome, a condition with no cure, no treatment, and a devastating prognosis. Hope lived for 199 days before she died quietly in her parents' arms. The grief was unlike anything Nancy had ever imagined possible. She had grown up in faith. She had believed with everything she had. She had prayed with everything she had. And she had still watched her daughter take her very last breath. But the story was not over. Not even close. In the wreckage of that loss, something completely unexpected began to stir inside Nancy Guthrie. She began to write. She began to speak. She began to reach out to others who were grieving, and found that in doing so, she was not just helping them. She was slowly, painfully, imperfectly beginning to help herself. Her first book, Holding On to Hope, was written from deep inside the grief itself. It was raw. It was honest. It was the kind of book that people pressed into each other's hands, with tears streaming down their faces, and said, "Read this. This is everything I could not say. This is everything I needed to hear." The book resonated in a way that Nancy had not fully anticipated. Letters began arriving from across the country, and then from across the world. From parents who had lost children, from spouses who had lost partners, from complete strangers who had never met Nancy Guthrie, but felt profoundly seen by her words in a way they had never felt seen before. Nancy began speaking at churches, conferences, and retreats. Her voice, gentle but unafraid, vulnerable but remarkably grounded, connected with audiences in a way that very few speakers in the world can achieve. She was not performing strength. She was demonstrating it, in real time, in front of everyone watching. She became a leading and respected voice in the conversation about grief, faith, and suffering. She founded respite retreats, intimate weekend gatherings for couples who had experienced the loss of a child. She created a community for people who had absolutely nowhere else to go with their particular brand of pain. She was becoming, quietly and without fanfare, one of the most important voices in the American faith community. But then, the unthinkable happened again. In 2001, Nancy and David's second child, a son named Gabriel, was born with the exact same condition, Zellweger syndrome. The same diagnosis, the same heartbreaking prognosis, the same devastating road stretching out ahead of them. Gabriel lived for 183 days. The world watched, and Nancy Guthrie stood at another graveside, burying another piece of herself, while thousands of people across the world quietly asked the same impossible question: how is she still standing? Here's what the world did not always see clearly. Nancy Guthrie kept standing. But standing did not mean she was not breaking. There were nights, long, silent, suffocating nights, when the weight of everything she had lost pressed down on her so heavily. She could barely breathe. There were moments when the faith she spoke about so powerfully in public felt like a distant, flickering light at the far end of a tunnel she could not find her way through. There were times when she sat across from someone else's grief and quietly carried the unbearable irony of being the expert in the room while feeling completely and utterly lost in her own heart. Few people knew this hidden truth about Nancy Guthrie, the public Nancy, the speaker, the author, the composed woman on the stage with the steady voice and the steady hands, was absolutely real. But she was not the whole person. Behind the ministry was a marriage under extraordinary stress. David and Nancy had made a deeply difficult and deeply personal decision after Gabriel's diagnosis. They chose a surgical procedure to ensure they would not conceive another child with the same condition. That decision carried its own grief, its own complicated, layered emotions, its own quiet mourning for a future that never had the chance to exist. There were also the relentless pressures of expectation. When you become the person that others come to in their darkest moments, you quietly lose the right, or at least it can feel that way, to have dark moments of your own. People needed Nancy Guthrie to be strong, and she gave them that strength over and over and over again, without hesitation and without complaint. But strength has a cost that nobody warns you about. There were seasons when Nancy has quietly admitted, in the pages of her books, in rare unguarded moments during interviews, that she struggled deeply with the performance of her own purpose, that the gap between who she was in public and who she was in private sometimes felt far wider than she could bridge. that even the most faithful, most purposeful person can reach a point where they lie awake in the dark and ask, is any of this actually working? Is my pain actually becoming something meaningful? Or am I simply surviving and calling it ministry? That question, that raw, terrifying, deeply human question, is the one the world was never fully prepared to hear from Nancy Guthrie. What most people do not fully understand about Nancy Guthrie is the extraordinary depth of her love. Not just her love for her children, though that love is evident in every single word she has ever written and every sentence she has ever spoken, but her love for ordinary life, for the quiet texture of everyday moments, for her husband David, who walked through the deepest valley imaginable with her not once but twice, and somehow remains standing right beside her through every single moment of it. David Guthrie is rarely the focus of the public story, but he is woven into every chapter of it. He is the man who held Nancy's hand at 2 different gravesides, who sat with her in the heavy silence after each loss, who chose again and again to stay and to build and to love rather than to collapse under the crushing weight of everything they had endured. Together, their relationship is one of the most quietly remarkable love stories in the entire world of faith, not because it has been perfect, but because it has been real. It has been tested in the most brutal and relentless ways imaginable, and it has held. Nancy has spoken in rare, unguarded moments about the particular loneliness that comes with grief. The world does not always validate the way people eventually expect you to move on, the way society grows quietly uncomfortable with sadness that lingers beyond a certain acceptable timeline, the way she sometimes had to fight, really fight, for the simple right to still be grieving. Children the world had long since moved on from remembering. That fight cost her more than she has ever fully allowed the world to see. As the years have passed, Nancy Guthrie has grown into a different kind of voice altogether, older, more settled, more willing to sit patiently inside complexity without rushing toward resolution, more at peace with the idea that some questions simply do not come with clean answers. She has continued writing, teaching, and speaking, but the tone has shifted in ways that are both subtle and profoundly meaningful. There is less urgency now to tie everything into a neat theological bow, more willingness to say openly, I do not always understand this, more genuine comfort with sitting inside the questions rather than sprinting anxiously toward the answers. She has spoken about getting older and looking back across the full landscape of her life with a kind of wonder that is equal parts deep gratitude and quiet bewilderment. She has watched the children of friends and colleagues grow up into fully formed adults. She has sat alone with the particular, aching tenderness of imagining who Hope and Gabriel might have become, what they would have looked like at 10 years old, at 20, at 30. That ache, she has said, never fully goes away. It simply changes shape over time. And perhaps the most profound shift in Nancy Guthrie's later years is this. She has stopped trying to be the person who has conquered grief. She has become, instead, the person who has learned to live alongside it, to carry it not as a burden that crushes, but as a companion that deepens, to allow the weight of what she has lost to make her more present, more tender, more alive in everything she still has. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. So what was the shocking secret? What was the truth that left investigators and those closest to Nancy Guthrie completely stunned? It was this: the woman who has spent decades helping millions of people navigate the darkest grief imaginable had never fully allowed herself to be helped in return. The revelation that stunned those who studied her story most carefully was not a scandal. It was a silence, a deliberate, sustained, deeply human silence about the true cost of being the person that everyone else leans on, about the profound loneliness of standing in the room as the expert when you are also the one who most needs care. Nancy Guthrie had built an entire ministry out of her pain, and in doing so, she had, perhaps unconsciously, perhaps necessarily, locked a part of that pain away from public view, not out of dishonesty, not out of pride, but out of the very real, very understandable, very human desire to protect what had become sacred to her, her purpose, her platform, the fragile and beautiful thing she had built out of pure wreckage. But secrets, even the most sacred ones. Carry weight. And the investigators, the writers, the theologians, the grief counselors who have spent years immersed in her work and her story, have gently but unmistakably pointed to this truth. Nancy Guthrie's most important contribution to the world may not ultimately be her books, or her retreats, or her decades of speaking. It may be this moment, right here, the moment when her complete and unfiltered story is finally allowed to fully breathe, when the world is invited to see not just the strength, but the true and staggering cost of it. Nancy Guthrie's story asks every single one of us a question we all need to sit with quietly. What are you carrying right now that the world does not know about? What grief, what failure, what silent fear are you managing entirely in private while presenting a composed and capable version of yourself to everyone around you? Because here is what Nancy Guthrie's life ultimately teaches us, not in her carefully chosen words, but in the full, complicated, costly, and beautiful arc of everything she has lived. You do not have to be okay to be purposeful. You do not have to have fully healed to help someone else begin their own healing. You do not have to have all the answers to ask exactly the right questions. And you absolutely do not have to be strong in every single moment to live a life of breathtaking, lasting, life-changing strength. Nancy Guthrie buried to children. She rebuilt herself not once but twice, from nothing, from absolute devastation. She turned her darkest and most private rooms into open doorways for others who were lost. And she did all of this while being a completely, thoroughly, gloriously imperfect human being, who some nights probably had no idea at all how she was going to find the strength to do it all over again tomorrow. That is not a weakness. That is, without question, the most quietly courageous thing a human being can ever do. Fame looks 1,000 different ways. Legacy looks 1,000 different ways. But meaning, real, lasting, soul-deep meaning, looks like Nancy Guthrie sitting across a table from someone whose entire world has just shattered around them, and saying, simply and without any performance at all, I know. I have been here, and I am still here. That is the real secret. That is the truth that left everyone stunned. Not that Nancy Guthrie had fallen, but that she had kept going, fully human, broken in places that never fully closed, and somehow, impossibly, made that enough.